Hello and welcome back to the WTF Sunderland Preview Podcast as the lads return to league action following a 2-week break. The international break is over and done with, and the delirium of the Arsenal draw is beginning to subside a little as we welcome a return to London to face Marco Silva's struggling Fulham side at the lovely Craven Cottage. He's not a debutant, it's actually his second appearance on the show, but things have changed a little bit. But I'm no less excited to welcome Jack Collins from the Fulhamish Pod alongside loads and loads and loads of other stuff. How are you, mate? You alright?
I'm grand, thank you, mate. It's a pleasure being back with you, and it's a pleasure being able to talk Sunderland again with you. You know, that's something quite special.
At the minute, yes, I'm not going to disagree in this the slightest.
Crack on, enjoy these bits, right? Like, this is what it's about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, look, it's been a little while since we caught up, but let's begin with the most recent stuff. Before international break, sorry, we'll get my words out in a minute. Fulham fell to a 2-0 defeat to Everton. You've had time to sort of stew and sit in that result. Sometimes it's a couple of days after the result, but we've obviously got a week and a bit, 10 days. How are you feeling about it, and how was the performance?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Fulham's worst performance of the season. And I think that's the worry about this, because you kind of look at the season up to that point, and it wasn't all sunshine and roses, right? Like, there's been obviously some frustrations around some things, but you actually look at the games. And if you'd said to me, you know, everything up to the Everton result, you'd said, right, you draw away at Brighton, you'll draw at home at United, you'll lose to Chelsea, you know, obviously circumstances notwithstanding, you'll beat Leeds at home, you'll beat Brentford at home, you'll lose at Villa Park, you'll lose at Bournemouth, you'll lose at home to Arsenal, you'll lose to Newcastle, but then you'll beat Wolves at home. I would have been like, yeah, sounds about par for the course. Like, it's not great, but it's also not dreadful in terms of, you know, the teams, you're beating the teams around you, you're beating the teams at home you expect to beat. I think the thing was that after that Wolves win and then the Wickham win in the Cup, which wasn't a great performance, but, you know, you get the job done, you get into the hat for the next round, you're looking at it and saying, yeah, we're about there or thereabouts. We're not going to be a brilliant side. We're not going to challenge for Europe this season, but there is a feeling of kind of like, it'll be okay, right? We'll keep our heads above water. We'll finish 13th. You know, that's where it was. The Everton result and the Everton performance in particular kind of burst that bubble a little bit for me. I was looking at it and watching that game and thinking, this is going to be a slog. And at that point, I sat down and I went, actually, Fulham are in a relegation scrap. Now, I think we have enough quality to keep our heads above water. I think there are at least 3 sides worse than us. And I'm not necessarily sitting here going, oh, we're going to go down. But I think if there were any illusions that we were just above that and better than it, they've kind of gone. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, and obviously it'll come on to the kind of Sunderland angle of it and all, but this year's Premier League is interesting and it's different, right? And actually the physicality of it, the directness of it, I think has played into your hands a little bit. I think it's also played into Leeds' hands and Burnley's hands a little bit, not in the same extent, obviously. But there are certain teams really struggling with this. Liverpool are one of them, right at the top of the table. And you look at the way they're trying to play, no one else is playing like that anymore. No one else is knocking the ball around. And Fulham are a side who play best in inverted commas, good games of football. And when the ball's on the deck and when it is kind of man-to-man and teams are doing things, Fulham tend to be able to hang with almost anyone. It's not necessarily we win those games, but we hang with them. I don't think Fulham are cut out for the physicality of this season's Premier League, and that is starting to become more and more of a worry as we go through these weeks.
You're looking at the team and stuff like that as well, and you're looking at players that can pull you out of the situation you're in. Big blow this week. You lose, obviously, Rodrigo Munoz with a hamstring injury. I think if you're looking at reports, it could be late January, February, so it's not exactly a good one. Yeah, it's long term, isn't it? Like, how big of a blow is that when you're looking at someone to kind of drag you out of the shitty end of the table?
Yeah, I mean, look, very much so. And again, it plays into that. Rodrigo's one of those players who can kind of mix it, who can play physical, who he can go long to, and is able, because he's a bit of a strange footballer, Rodrigo Muniz. When he came in, he looked like a baby giraffe, you know, like limbs everywhere, like completely all over the gaff. And we were watching him going, what? Like, who is this geezer? He went on loan to Middlesbrough. It was dreadful at Middlesbrough. Like, couldn't get a game. Came back to Fulham in that January, and everyone was like, right, where else is he going off to on loan? And he came in and went through this mad purple patch, and we were like, hang on, who's this? This is not the player that we sent off on loan, and he hasn't done this at Borough because I've been watching him. And so he kind of is still quite a flaily footballer, but he's really awkward to defend because he's got big limbs, and also he gets in behind and he's like deceptively quick. So he can spin a defender. He can, go man to man with them. And actually, I think Fulham are lacking a little bit of that hustle and bustle. Raul is a lovely footballer, right? Like always kind of has been. But he's very much a lovely footballer. He likes the ball to feet. He likes the flicks and tricks. He likes to mix it up with, players around him. He's not the kind of player you look to and go, right, we're just going to lump it over the top when things are getting a little bit uncomfortable, and he'll chase them down and hassle and harry. And so I think that Rodrigo being out is a bigger blow than people are talking about. I don't think it's sort of like season ending or, it will define the entirety of the season. But it just means Fulham don't really have a plan B. And it means Raul for 90 minutes pretty much for the rest of the season, because we brought in Jonah Kusiasare on loan from Bayern Munich. Marco clearly doesn't trust him yet. We saw a little bit of why in the Wickham game. And the other option is Adama Traore up front. And to be honest, if I have to see that again, I might throw my season ticket in the Thames. So, we've got to that point with it. Not that Adama's a bad player, he's just very much not a number 9. And I think Fulham are looking a little bit predictable and a little bit short of options right now as well.
If there's any Fulham fans listening to this, there's just one thing that made me feel happy about the championship season, and there was literally nothing apart from this one singular thing. Jay Clark-Salter, terrible for us, awful for us. I'm sure he's done well elsewhere. I think he has, I don't know, I don't care. His only thing of note that he did for Sunderland was absolutely half Adama Traore when he was playing for Middlesbrough. And it's one of the funniest tackles I've ever seen in my life. Straight red card, and in the season of just struggling absolute crap, that was the only thing I enjoyed about it. And you mentioning his name always brings me back to that, but I'm going off on a tangent. Let's pull myself back here. Tough old start, as you said before. There's results in there, and there's games where you think 1-0 Arsenal here and there, and Chelsea away, and there's games where maybe on paper you'd expect to lose them narrowly. It's annoying, but you've lost them. But you pick up that big 3-0 win against Wolves, you start going, all right, okay, here we go. This is where it kind of kicks on. I know Wolves are poor, just to be kind. Yeah. They're not good. But a 3-0 win is kind of what you want. When you're looking for a result, you take a 1-0 narrow win. You go and hammer them 3-0. You think, all right, here we go. Yeah. So how frustrating is that? Like, you didn't just not build on it against Everton. You went and put in, as you said yourself, the worst performance of the season.
Yeah, I mean, and also, to kind of link it back to the last question, Fulham had a really good 10-minute spell in that game when Rodrigo Muniz came on and was like, oh, okay, it looks like we're playing football. And then he pulled up and went off again, and we stopped playing football, and that was the end of the game. And it was like, okay, cool. And then you get the second goal, and time's up, and it's to kind of like put us out of our misery. It's like a wounded animal limping around at that point. But you kind of look at it, and to see that momentum immediately fade. And also, there's the entire Marco Silva question, right? Because he's out of contract in the summer. There are questions about what the succession plan looks like, whether he'll sign a new contract. There's a bit of an impasse, it seems, at the club, where the club are like, go on, sign a new contract and we'll give you money to spend in January. And he's going, well, you didn't back me in the summer in the way that I wanted. And I know Fulham spent money, but he's made it abundantly clear he wanted a centre midfielder. He hasn't got said centre midfielder. Andreas Pereira left. And you're thinking, okay, where are we going here? And he's come out and publicly said that a week after the transfer window. So you're kind of looking at it and thinking, he's not happy. He's saying, I tell you what, back me in January and I'll sign a new contract in February. And they're saying, no, we're not going to back you in January if you haven't signed a new contract, because you might be gone 6 months later. And look, you can understand both sides of that argument. But Marco Silva is the best manager that Fulham have had since Roy Hodgson. Like, he's someone who's brought a sense of calm and stability to the club. He's someone who's kind of walked in and been like, and I've watched, right, managerial troubles and travails elsewhere over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, and just sort of thinking, glad that's not us. Glad that's not us. We're pretty solid. We're pretty stable. The entire fan base, pretty much to a man, loves Marco Silva. They all would like Marco Silva to sign a new contract, and maybe that's a slight generalization, but it's not much of one. Like, the overwhelming feeling around the club is that Marco Silva, should stay. If we can find a way to get him to stay, that should be number one priority from a Fulham perspective. But the problem with that is that it's now hanging over the season, and you start to see the headlines, Fulham weighing up Marco Silva's future. Now, Fulham wouldn't be weighing up Marco Silva's future after a 2-0 defeat to Everton, right? Especially at the Hill Dickinson, where they've lost once, right? Like, that's not the kind of thing that you would be doing in any other season. But I can understand why the club are looking at options in that regard, because they're like, well, are we just limping to the end of this? And if that's the case, like, when was the last time, Jurgen Klopp aside, you saw a manager reach the end of their contract for a mid-table club? Like, it just doesn't happen, right? Like, these things just don't happen. And so to be in that situation is a bit weird. And there's not really any context or things you can like lean on to say, has this happened elsewhere? Did they end up sort of meandering towards the last few months of the contract? It's quite a difficult one to read. And it just seems to be hanging a real shadow over the whole club at the moment.
I wanted to ask about that because Marco Silva, when I look at look, I always say social media is no barometer for football. It's not a barometer for life at the minute, if I'm honest. But
Yeah.
when, when I do look at it, if I'm looking at what Fulham fans are saying, if you're doing a bit of research on the words Marco Silva, Fulham, in general, most people are going, no pressure on him. Yeah, not a great start, but it's quite realistic and it's kind of weirdly refreshing. But he has this contract. If you go onto Google and you type in Marco Silva Fulham into the Google News search sites, it's the replacement, the succession plan, everything you've just mentioned. There's quite clearly something hanging over the club, as you've just said. How much does it worry that this would hang to the point where the things go a little bit further south than what you'd want to do? Because without tempting fate here with Sunderland, the three promoted teams look like they could feasibly at least have a chance at staying up this season, if not all staying up at some point, if they're very lucky. Them two will be fine.
you'll be absolutely fine. You know, we're not talking about relegation battles for you lot. We're talking about European charges. And even if that falls short, it's been a successful. You finish, someone says 17th on goal difference, you're like, take your hand, shake it now. Like, you know, it's one of those at the start of the season. Not anymore, right? Okay, fair enough. But like at the start of the season, you know, taking that hands down. So everything is a step in the right direction. I still think we're better than Leeds and Burnley. Like, I still think that Leeds are going to struggle to score goals across the entire season. And look, maybe that changes. They're bringing a new manager and signing number 9 in January. Like, and maybe the flip side of the season. I think we're better than Wolves. I think we're better than West Ham. Like, so there's 4 there. I don't think we're better than that many other teams, is probably how I would put it. Like, there's not loads of teams that I'm looking at and saying, yeah, you're considerably worse than Fulham. And so when you do start to get to sort of like, oh, there's 5 teams below us, and one of them's Forest, who have seemed to have worked their stuff out, right? Like, and you know, maybe not to the extent of what last season was, but they'll probably be fine. Like, you're starting to run out of options, and it's like, oh, there's 4 below us. It's like, I can't drop that much more before you start to get a little bit uncomfortable. And I think that there is a sense that, you know, if this run was to go badly, and you know, we get to Christmas and Fulham are in the bottom 3. Then yeah, the club maybe do pull the trigger and they go, we bring in a new manager now, we spend in January, you back that manager. Like, do I think that's the right thing to do? No. Like, I think the right thing to do is be like, we'll back you in January, Marco, and then you sign this contract, you know, do a pre-contract, I don't know, prenup, whatever it is that you need to do to get him to sign the bits. But like, we would like him to stay. He's been such a successful manager and also someone who's just brought a bit of calm to the Cottage. You know, for the years of yo-yoing were chaotic, and look, some of it was fun and some of it obviously wasn't fun. You get to this point, you're like, yeah, we just sort of cruised the championship that first year under Marco Silva, and then 3 years of pretty stable. I wasn't too worried about relegation battles, Premier League security. You know, we would have bitten your hand off for that 5 years ago. And now it's a bit like, oh, is he pushing us forward? If we, you know, yeah, I think we need to put the context of where everyone else is and how kind of egalitarian to a point the Premier League feels this season. You know, not that everyone can beat everyone, because I don't think that's necessarily the case, but the middle order feels as close as it's ever been, and that goes all the way down to the edge of the relegation zone. There doesn't feel like loads and loads between like a Fulham and an Everton, for example. But yeah, that performance at Hill Dickinson is dreadful, and they looked a million miles better than us. So I think that probably some context is always needed with the Marco Silva stuff. But as you say, the overwhelming fan sentiment is we would like him to stay. And if Fulham can get that done sooner rather than later, and look, I don't hold out major hope for it, if I'm honest. I'm kind of steeling myself for Brendan Rodgers walking through the door in June. But yeah, it does feel a little bit like one of those where the situation is just going to kind of remain at an impasse until the end of the season. And whether that's enough for Fulham to be able to make sure that there's no major trouble towards the end, I don't 100% know.
I think with the way the season started, I can probably understand what your answer to this would be. But like long term, with a club like Fulham, and I hope Fulham fans don't mind me saying this, in the cusp of London clubs you've got, they're not the biggest, but they're certainly not the smallest. So then you look at Fulham's recent history, European final. There's not many teams that have done that. Okay, he didn't win it. Sometimes people say you don't remember the losers, but I certainly remember that Fulham run. So, you know, it is what it is. And I would kill for that. I'd kill for just
Exactly.
games, to be honest. But what's Fulham's aims, like long term? Now, I mean, not like 20, 25 years in time, because I mean, the utopian answer is we win the Premier League and we win the Champions League and we do with Leicester. But like, what would Fulham fans like to see happen over the next maybe 2 to 3 years? Obviously, stay up the season, keep yourself safe. It's been a different season, but kicking on from there, be it under Marco Silva, be it under someone else, what is the realistic aim of Fulham fans of how far you can go and how realistically you should aim?
Palace, right? Like, as
Yeah.
in, like, you look at what Palace did up to last year, you could probably make an argument that Fulham and Palace were the two biggest clubs in England that hadn't won a trophy. Right, like of any note. Now, I count the Intertoto Cup, but I appreciate that most people don't. But, you're looking at that and saying, okay, and now Palace, you see that. Ollie Glasner, excellent cup manager, goes and wins the FA Cup, wins again at Wembley to win the Community Shield. And you're thinking, that's the day. And then you get Europe off the back of that as well, right? So, like, that's the days in the sun. And there's a Saw Doctor song, to win just once, I think is probably the kind of move here. It's like okay, Fulham have had days out and brilliant days out at Wembley. The two playoff finals obviously were incredible days in very different ways, given that one of them was behind closed doors. But you look at those things and think, to get to a Wembley final or a FA Cup semi-final, and I think that Marco Silva knows that if he was to win silverware, he would immediately become Fulham's greatest ever manager, which is a bit of a random thing to say, but it's true. In the same way that I think that most Palace fans would probably look at this and say, yeah, Oliver Glasner, probably our greatest ever manager, in terms of took them to heights that no one else had taken them to. So I think the answer is, you look at that, you want Premier League stability, the potential of pushing for a European spot, and then to win a cup of some description, whether that be the Carabao or the FA Cup, or whether that be to get something like the Conference League and potentially go and win something like that. That, I think, is the day in the sun that Fulham fans want. It's not there's not a sense here of Fulham should be pushing for Champions League football. Like, when Mohamed Al Fayed came in, he was like, I'm going to make Fulham the Manchester United of the South. And I think everyone looked at him and was like, all right, pal. Like, and look, a remarkable rise through that period, as difficult a character and a human being and as kind of horrific as a person as he was. For Fulham Football Club, and I know you can't separate all of this, but for Fulham Football Club, that was a good period, right? And I think what we're seeing now is the potential with Marco Silva, and as you say, look, maybe that ends and maybe everyone's honeymoon comes to an end after a while. With Marco Silva, it's felt like Fulham were on the cusp of building at something that's sustainable again and able to actually, compete in the mid-tiers of the Premier League and not be fazed by coming up against a Liverpool or an Arsenal in the Cup and be like, you know what? Yeah, we might lose this game, but we give them a go. Going and beating United at Old Trafford last season. I think that is probably the end goal. I don't think Fulham fans are sitting here going, yeah, we'll win the league in 10 years' time. Like, no one's that unrealistic. And you don't get moments like that very often. Once a lifetime, and we've had it, unfortunately, in Leicester. So I think we're all looking at it and thinking that's a slightly different scenario. But I don't think it's like Fulham need to be challenging for the top four to be, a club that we can all believe in and love. It's just finding that stability and also having that possibility of maybe that one day in the sun.
When you look at your transfer window, and I think you start getting to like 10 to 15 games in, so kind of approaching that part where you go, well, who's been the players that have impressed so far? Then I looked at Fulham's transfer window because I was like, who did they sign in the summer again? I looked and I was like, oh, like no one pretty much. And maybe my research is really bad, but the more I search, the more I see you signed pretty much no one. Like, what did you do in the summer window?
Well, I think you've just nailed it. Well, I
Nothing.
mean, look, we broke our club record transfer fee to bring in Kevin from Shakhtar Donetsk. We brought in Sami
Great name.
Chukwueze. Yeah, just great stuff, right? Like, just
Kevin.
Big Kev. But Sami Chukwueze comes in on loan from AC Milan with an option to buy. Jonah Kusiasare comes in on loan from Bayern Munich with an option, but 18 years old and red raw, as we sort of touched on at the start of the podcast. You look at it and just sort of thinking, yeah, it's much the same. And look, there is an element that you can argue, I think. Look, there were different bits of this because Fulham very much nearly signed Tyreek George from Chelsea on deadline day, but that was contingent on Harry Wilson leaving. And Marco Silva loves older players, right? He's always kind of favoured a little bit more of a senior, more mature group than necessarily the youngsters. It's taken a while for players to kind of get their bearings and emerge, and we haven't seen that many youngsters. Now, Josh King, the great exception perhaps, and the shining light for Fulham across the course of this season so far. But his emergence felt like a bit of a signing. And then you bring in 2 new wingers and a third choice striker. I think we were crying out for a central midfielder, not just someone to be able to plug, a gap when we're short of either Sasha Lukic or Sander Berge, but also someone who's a little bit more, or a little bit less safe than those two. They're a very good shield wall, right? Like they're a very, very good defensive partnership. I think you can get away with having one of those players. You can't always get away with having 2, especially in games where you're at home and you're kind of hoping to dominate and find those passes. They've tried Alex Iwobi in there recently, and to be honest, against Wolves, it looked really good. I'm taking everything against Wolves with a pinch of salt, because I don't know if that was just Wolves being absolutely dreadful or it was something that changed within Fulham's outlook, but it looked brighter. But like Fulham could have really done with someone like a Hayden Hackney, for example, who's just able to play in a midfield too, but also get the ball forward, to look up, to get your head up and get into those channels. I think that's the player that Fulham are missing in order to be able to kind of move forward. And whilst I appreciate that Marco Silva was pretty much the same squad as last year. Look, I did well with that squad. We competed across multiple fronts, all of the things. I think you could also look at it and say standing still is going backwards when everyone else is improving. And I'm not sure that Fulham fundamentally improved all that much over the course of the summer.
Yeah, and I think the way the Premier League works, like I was the one in the summer that said, let's give some of these boys that got promoted a chance, and now I'm looking going, okay, let's give some of them, maybe 5 maximum, a chance, because these other lads are really, really good at football.
Well, we'll see when AFCON drops, won't we?
Don't talk to me about AFCON. Doesn't exist.
Hey, mate, it's not great for us either. No, Calvin Bassey, Alex Iwobi, Samuel Chukwueze all gone, and suddenly that's the spine of the team out.
I believe you can cancel the game if you have so many players out. So fingers crossed, Sunderland have got that one wrapped up their sleeve, and we've got a 5-week suspension of football. Now, you know what? I actually think we might be all right. But like it is a thing, isn't it? I think fingers crossed we'll be fine. But look, I did want to talk about Sunderland because I really like doing that, especially recently. Like, I know you've kept Niners over the years, because obviously we spoke when we played in the FA Cup a few years ago when we just came up with the championship, and we've kept in touch since. Like, I feel like I'm basically asking you just to wax lyrical here, but it is just a question I ask every week. What have you made of our start and where we currently sit in the table?
Yeah, I mean, look, I did a podcast on Sunderland the other week with Dougie Critchley on Ranks FC, and we had a really nice time. He's a Sunderland fan too, and we had a really nice time sitting around and chatting it through and trying to work out, whether this was like sustainable, whether it was legitimate. And we kind of came to the conclusion that it was, not necessarily to suggest that, Sunderland are going to be pushing a Champions League place come May, but not so much so that it's going to be a complete and utter slide down the table as reality kind of hits. And I know Sunderland fans hate it, and I know there's that Hull City reference that keeps coming up. Everyone talks about it. Also, everyone kind of forgets the Hull stayed up that year. They didn't go down. They went down the year after, but they didn't go down that season. And that's what a brilliant start gets you, right? It gets you breathing space. And it also means there's a couple of elements. The start was soft, right? Like, I don't think anyone's going to sit there and deny the fact that it was a favourable set of fixtures. You still have to win them. And one of the things that happened last year, I think, with the promoted sides is, the first few games, there's all that excitement in the stadium. There's all that kind of buzz around it. And a couple of those teams put in decent performances and didn't get results. And suddenly the buzz starts to fade. And then suddenly November, and you're like, we're in a bit of a relegation battle here. And by the time it gets to January, it's like losses on losses on losses. I think with Sunderland, there's not only enough momentum in the bank that a couple of losses wouldn't set back the entire vibe at the Stadium of Light, but also about the fact that now Sunderland are going in games. And look, that Arsenal game is a prime example of this. It would have been very, very easy to write that off and be like, look, it's Arsenal. They're beating everybody. They're top of the league. They're probably going to run away with it. This is one we can accept, especially 2-1 down in the 93rd minute. But you didn't. Right. And I think that freedom to kind of open up and have a go at teams is built by the fact that there is now, building blocks in place. There is now points on the board. Sunderland are in a lovely position in the table to go out there and be like, you know what, why not? Like, why not? Why not go ahead and have a go at Arsenal? And if we lose 4-0, we lose 4-0. But we probably won't, because we know and we believe within this team. We know that the atmosphere is going to be unbelievable. And there's that level of trust within the team, what I think is probably Reggie Lebris's best thing that he's done here, being able to mold a group of lads like that into that kind of cohesive unit in such a quick period of time. And look, obviously it helps that the first 3 goals of the season are scored by new face, are scored by old faces being assisted by new faces, and it gives a sense of continuity and all of those elements in the equation. But I think it's a really genuinely very good squad. I think that there are profiles in there that fit really nicely for the Premier League. I think when you look at last year's promoted teams as a comparison, one of the things that none of them really had was any grit in the middle of the park. And you watch what Sunderland did, and obviously Granit Xhaka takes the headlines, but I love Noah Siddiqui, and I thought Diarra was excellent to begin the season as well. And then you're sort of looking and going, well, that's the engine room. And whilst Xhaka can have the plaudits, these lads there are one, making their way, they're two, becoming accustomed to Premier League. They have someone next to them, a bit like Brentford with Jan Mollyak and Henderson, right? You're seeing that kid emerge and explode because he has Jordan Henderson next to him. Not necessarily because, I think that he's the best player in the world, but because suddenly you've got a really talented kid with an arm around his shoulder and going, you know what, just maybe that way, a little bit of game management. I just think it's a really well put together squad. I love Chemsedine Talbi. I think he's absolutely exquisite. I thought he was exquisite in Belgium. And I love the fact that he's starting to really feel like he's adapting now to the Premier League. I think there's profiles of physical player in there that allow you to mix it up, and you were seeing this, right? Robbie coming on, and not only the assist in the Chelsea game, but then obviously the goal in the Arsenal game as well. But the ability to be like, okay, we've got a really kind of weird profile of player in Brian Robbie. He's not really like anyone else I've ever seen. He's a bit of a strange kind of footballer in many ways. And you go on, lob him on for 10 minutes at the end and see what they make of that, because I don't know what to make of it. So these defenders almost certainly won't. Like, being able to do that and mix it up, I just think it's a really nice mesh. I think it's a really nice mould, and I'm a huge fan of what has been put together at Sunderland at the moment.
It's interesting you were saying about Siddiqui there, because I think every Sunderland fan listening to that will echo that, and I think I don't want to say I'm sick of it, because it's not the right term or phrase. But I was sitting downstairs with Ashley, my fiance, and we went, "Why is it on?" And I'm sorry, Sky Sports, I'm going to give you more shit. I know you've had a bit this week, but I'm going to go add a little bit more on. All right, put a bit more pink sparkles on it, because that makes everything better. I'm a little bit tired of hearing Sunderland signed Xhaka X, Y, and Z. Sunderland signed players. Oh my God, that's why they're so good. It's just not the case. And I think anyone who watches football or has watched Championship football or watched how Sunderland have done things, there's clearly more to it than we just signed Xhaka and loads of other players, and we're just basically Forest, but with Granit Xhaka, which is just, or Fulham as it was, spending loads of money that time.
A couple of years ago,
Like, do you think it's a little bit simplistic to say that Sunderland just bought a lot of good players, Xhaka's been really good, and that's why we're good? There's more to it than that, isn't there? And I think that's what's... People talk about being a blueprint for and people have used Brentford and Brighton. If you look what Sunderland have done over the past few years with the profile of player we're signing, and what we've done in terms of the profile of player we brought in, as you said before, grit, determination, energy, strength in midfield, that's not touched on as much as it should be, in my opinion. Do you agree with me on that?
Yeah, I think that some of the signings that maybe went under the window are the kind of the ones that aren't going to take the headlines might be the engine room here, if you know what I mean. And that's the case. And look, obviously there's a mould. And I think, as I said, the actual ability to bring that group of players together, because look, there are lots of disparate parts, right? And if you bring in lots of new players, it can go one of two ways. Now, Forest sort of threw an immense amount of shit at the wall, and some of it stuck, and eventually they turned into a very good football team, and they deserve credit for that. But they also threw an immense amount of shit at the wall. You actually look at the signings that Sunderland made in the summer, well, almost all of them have had an impact to some degree or another. With a couple of exceptions and a couple of notable exceptions. Almost everyone has come in and done some sort of job already. And that, for me, is the difference. Because you're not just signing players because you're like, oh, they're a good player. And look, putting that kind of aside for a second, you bring in a new core of players, and bear in mind how young Sunderland were in the Championship, right? To come into the Premier League, if you come in with that young core, and also, and also the Championship doesn't always translate to the Premier League, but think about where Sunderland finished the season as opposed to a Leeds or a Burnley, and the way that, they went about their business, and the way that it all happened in the playoffs, where it felt like a narrative storyline that just kept getting written. you're looking at it and thinking, okay, so one, you needed to bring in said players. That's fine, right? Like that's a job and that's part of it. You have to strengthen. You also have to find some experience within that camp because this was an incredibly young side. You've got a manager who is, relatively youthful within his coaching career, who's never managed in the Premier League before. And look, a lot's made of that. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the be all and end all, if I'm honest. But you look at him and what he built at Lorient, for example, and you think, okay, is that a translatable model? The question was always going to be what that looked like in a different league. It's one thing being at the top of a division. It's another thing being at the bottom of one. Not that you've experienced that, but coming at it from a slightly different angle. And so I think that, for me, it's about that mold. It's about that meld. And for someone like Reggie Lebris, who hasn't necessarily kind of had all that long in England, he hasn't had all that long at Sunderland, to be able to get everyone through that door, when it comes to the, day after deadline day and go, right, these lads are all going to be on the same page by the time we get to the next week is, I think a genuine, really, really impressive achievement of management. But on top of that, what I think about Sunderland's business that was so smart was that early business set up the end of the window. So someone like Lucharel Hirschroeder, who I love, by the way, I thought was absolutely a really, really good footballer. But on deadline day, Sunderland don't make that signing if they're scrambling for parts. They make that signing because they see a player who's there and available, and they're thinking, are we going to be in that conversation? And you go, why not? We're not going. Yeah, why not? And then suddenly you're thinking about that. Lucharel Hirschroeder would start for almost every side in the bottom half of the Premier League, and probably about 6 in the top half, if I'm honest. But Sunderland were there, ready and available, and just went, you know what, we can offer you something, and we've got results on the board to show you, and we've got players through the door we can show you believe in the project. That, I think, is a very underrated element of where the summer got to for Sunderland in terms of having the then appeal and pull by the end of the window to be like, yeah, you know what, we can throw a bit at Ajax. We can throw a bit at, RB Leipzig for Hirschroeder and go, you know what, this is something you want to be a part of. And they walk through the door and they're like, yeah, actually I do. That's very, very impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I know I spoke about Xhaka before, but it did feel like when Xhaka signed that, kind of everyone went, oh, I wouldn't mind being part of that. And then you see Makwele coming through, who's already a cult hero, and you see him shaking hands with Xhaka, and you're like, oh, hang on, he's had a conversation. And yeah, I agree. I think the early work we did as well, you were suddenly going to preseason games going, oh, I want to see these players because we've signed 8 of them. Let's see what they're like. And then it gets to the deadline day and you go, well, we'll add a left back here, a centre back here. And yeah, I mean, look, it's the best time I've ever had supporting Sunderland. And I include the Quinn and Phillips years in that. I mean, obviously the forward line's not quite as good as that, but I do include that in it, which is interesting because I've been asking this question every week. And for I think 2 years, the answer to this question in League One was Aidan McGeady. Then it was Jack Clark for 3 years. Now it's kind of a lovely mix of different players, which is making it a bit more of an interesting question. So I've got the 2 questions to go. This one, any prediction. But if you could take one player from Sunderland's team to fit into Fulham's squad, for whatever reason it may be, who would you take and why would you take him?
It's a great question. And I think now you're looking at it and thinking, well, as you say, it's kind of pick of the bunch, right? I think that, as I said earlier, Fulham a little bit in dire need of something in the middle of the park. I really, really like Siddiqui. I think he's a really, really talented footballer. And whilst the sexy answer is Granit Xhaka, I think, if I was just given a free hit of this, it would be him or Chemsedine Talbi, I think, for me. I just think that they're both really, really good, young, talented footballers with really bright futures ahead of them. But probably considering Fulham's squad needs, I'd probably go Siddiqui.
We've been looking at Siddiqui the past few weeks, me and the guys behind, and look, you always think your own team's better than everyone else's, and you always have higher ambitions. But someone went, I have a feeling that he might be our record sale in a couple of years' time, if not in the summer, because he's been that good. And I think Sunderland fans will be pleased to hear Siddiqui get a little bit of credit. And obviously he wins last night against Nigeria. Good luck in the World Cup, but please come back home safe. Tough game, I think, for Saturday. I think every game's tough in the Premier League, apart from Wolves, apparently. But even that was not the easiest for us, to be honest. It's a sticky game of points until we get the late goal at the end. Or should I say they scored it for us. Fulham has been a good hunting ground for us over the past few years. Take out the FA Cup game. I love saying that we've got a draw, I suppose. But when I've been ambitious on the podcast and said, we'll win or we'll get a draw, or specifically when I said we'll get a win, we've ended up not doing it. So I'm going to continue on with the kind of negativity with the predictions because I'm superstitious. I am going to say 1-1. And if I'm honest, and I know this might come across as negative, I'd probably take that because there's no such thing as a bad point on the road. I don't think anywhere in the Premier League. I don't think there's one team you could say no draw is a bad result. Even Wolves, to that extent, any draw is a good result. So I'll say 1-1 because of my superstition, but I also would probably take it. But where do you see it going?
I'd shake your hand right now for a 1-1 draw. How about that? And I think that probably tells you where we are. Look, Fulham are better at home. And that has been the case over the season. You know, you actually, if you'd looked at this before the season began and said that's a newly promoted team at home, I would have expected Fulham on paper, you know, but before a ball was kicked, to take 3 points at home against Sunderland. I don't believe that now. And I think with Rodrigo Muniz out, we're never good coming back from an international break. I don't know what it is, but the team just never seems to function properly. There are moments of magic in the team. I feel without Muniz, we're in a little bit of trouble in that regard up top. And especially given that Raul has been flying around to Mexico and then getting booed by his own fans in Mexico as well. Probably not coming back in the finest mindset that he's been in a while. So I struggle to legitimately and genuinely say we win this game, and I'll say the same on Fulhamish. This isn't me pandering to the crowd. Like I don't see it. I would take 1-1, but I have a funny feeling we might just get very similar to what we saw at Everton, and you might just sort of end up winning this, not comfortably, but I'd say maybe a 2-0. I wouldn't be shocked if we walked out of there on Saturday and you'd won 2-0.
If we do win 2-0 on Saturday, I'm going to start suddenly thinking Champions League might actually be a thing instead of taking the piss out of it. So I'll take it. But look, I think 1-1. But Jack, would you get catching up?
I'll shake your hand for it. As I say, give me the point and I'll take it, and we can all walk away happy.
I'm happy with it. Look, good to speak to you again, especially in the Premier League. We said last time we were on, let's hope it is in the Premier League at some point and not the Championship. It has been, so good to catch up, mate. Nice to see you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, mate. It's lovely to be able to sit here and talk about Sunderland, and also talk about a Sunderland team that have been such a breath of fresh air and been such a brilliant side to watch this season. I've really, really enjoyed your stuff.
I won't disagree.